Ladies, we need to talk about Tempdrop. Tempdrop gives you everything you need to effortlessly track your fertility. Wear the Tempdrop sensor while you sleep for accurate temperature readings without the stress of early morning wake-ups. Tempdrop's accompanying app enables you to chart an array of symptoms alongside your temperature, including cervical mucus and OPKs. Combine these fertility signs all in one place to identify your fertile window and confirm ovulation. Whether you're trying to conceive, avoiding pregnancy, or want to chart for health reasons, Tempdrop makes fertility awareness accessible to all women, even if you don't have regular cycles or sleeping patterns. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/tempdrop and use coupon code FertilityFriday at checkout for 10% off your order. That's fertilityfriday.com/tempdrop. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 374. Welcome to the Fertility Friday podcast, your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I'm your host, Lisa Hendrickson-Jack. I'm the author of The Fifth Vital Sign and the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Journal. I'm a certified fertility awareness educator and holistic reproductive health practitioner with nearly 20 years of experience teaching women to connect to their fifth vital sign through menstrual cycle charting, balancing hormonal health, and optimizing the menstrual cycle without hormones. I'm outspoken about hormonal birth control and its impact on fertility and overall health because you have the right to know how your body works and how artificial hormones disrupt that natural process. I host live coaching programs to help you achieve optimal fertility and health because it's important to have healthy menstrual cycles regardless of whether or not you want to have babies. I'm also a wife and mother of 2 beautiful boys. I know, I'm a busy girl, but I managed to fit it all in. This podcast is designed to empower you to take full control of your cycles, your fertility, and your overall health. And I'm so excited that you're here with us today. Today, I'm sharing one of my first episodes, an episode that I recorded in the first year of the podcast. And this is my interview with Toni Weschler, the author of Taking Charge of Your Fertility. And I remember when I reached out to Toni, of course, really nervous if she would actually say yes and come on the show. And she was so gracious and so sweet. And of course, for those of you who have the fifth vital sign, Toni was so gracious to read the fifth vital sign and, write a little endorsement for me. And I remember just feeling so honored and blessed because it's kind of like that coming full circle moment, because certainly my experience of charting my cycles with fertility awareness began essentially when I bought Taking Charge of Your Fertility. That was the first resource that I went to, and certainly it started me on charting. And a lot has happened since then, but without Toni's book, it makes you wonder what this landscape would look like. It is still the number one book that women go to for fertility awareness knowledge for, conception, and just that general, it's the starting point for most of us who have found our way to fertility awareness cycle charting. Toni has so much wisdom to share, and ultimately, even if I think about where fertility awareness was when I first started and how few women really knew about it, and how 20 years later, there's just such a completely different landscape. It's still not, I would say, mainstream, but still today, it's completely different. So many women know about charting. There's so many different charting apps that have brought women into this knowledge in one way or another. And the way that I look at it is just, what an incredible role that Toni's book played in this process. And just imagine, I just took a peek at my 20th anniversary edition of Taking Charge of Your Fertility, which came out in 2015, unless I'm getting this wrong, which would mean that the first edition came out in 1995. So to think about it, it amazes me that Toni brought this knowledge into the world so long ago, like 25, 26 years ago. And I think it's made just such a huge impact. I mean, we still have a ways to go, but I'm just so thankful for women like Toni Weschler and all the women who have been working in this field for decades to bring us to where we are now. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into my interview with Toni Weschler. So welcome to the show, Toni.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for being here. So I did give you an introduction, but I'd love for you to take a moment and tell the listeners about your journey, how you actually discovered the fertility awareness method, and what inspired you 20 years ago to write that first edition of Taking Charge of Your Fertility.
Well, clearly I didn't have my senses about me. If I had known what hell it would take to write this book, I'm not sure I would have done it. But at any rate, well, as some of you probably read in the intro of my book, my actual introduction to fertility awareness itself was through a really humiliating experience, and maybe some of you read it. What I did was kind of a very unusual route to learn about fertility awareness. I worked out in some avocado fields on a kibbutz in Israel years ago, like maybe 30 years ago or so. I was working out at like 4 a.m. or so. I would drive out on this very bumpy tractor, and I would work in the avocado fields on the kibbutz. And one day when I was out there, I just had this epiphany, and I have no idea where it came from, but I had just decided. I had already graduated from college, and I had just decided that I wanted to do something with women's health, and I have no idea where it came from. So I'm out there digging around the roots in the avocado fields in the blazing sun, and this is where I got my epiphany. So the humiliation comes in when I returned back from my year on the kibbutz and proceeded to go to a women's clinic, because I noticed that this was well before the Internet. This was in the days before the Internet. And I noticed that they had an ad for a women's health educator. And I naively thought, oh, I love everything to do with women's health. I'm just going to apply to be a women's health educator. So I arrived at this clinic feeling pretty confident about myself that, all I needed to do was just have a love of women's health, and that would be it. All would be good to go. I'd be in. And while I'm sitting there, as I'm kind of glancing around at all the various paraphernalia in the clinic, I notice that there is a brochure on the coffee table in front of me that is something about the fertility awareness method. And I pick it up, and I'm struck with this sense of doom, because my reaction was, oh my God, I'm about to apply to a women's clinic that teaches the rhythm method. Oh no, what do I do? Do I say something? Do I keep my mouth shut? Do I risk that maybe I would alienate them if I say something about, why are you teaching the rhythm method, or do I, open my mouth, and what do I do? So I decided, I had to seek the truth. And when the executive director called my name to come in for my interview, I walked in, just feeling this sense of anxiety, like, oh God, what do I do? And before I even sat down, I blurted out something to the effect that I was really surprised that they taught the rhythm method at this clinic, because I had known it to be a very reputable clinic, and what were they doing teaching the rhythm method? And no sooner had I blurted that out that the director looked at me with this look of kind of disdain and said, wait, we teach what? And I, kind of meekly said, we teach the rhythm method, right? I mean, here's the brochure. Don't you teach the rhythm method here? I mean, everybody knows the rhythm method doesn't work. And she looked at me with these really kind of annoyed eyes and said, Miss, what is your name? Weschler, yes, Miss Weschler. I think it probably would bode well for us to have a women's health educator that doesn't even know the difference between fertility awareness and the rhythm method.
Wow.
Yeah, that's what I said. That is what I said. I felt the blood just drain from my head. I was so embarrassed, and she basically shook my hand and said, thank you for coming in. And I just basically went out with my tail between my legs, got in my car, and started sobbing. I was so humiliated. But I got home, and I read that brochure over and over, and I thought, well, if this isn't the rhythm method, then what is this? So now I come to my second dilemma. The first was, do I say something or not? The second dilemma is, how do I go back now and take their class and kind of sneak in there incognito so I don't run into this executive director again? Because now my curiosity is really piqued, and at the same time, I've humiliated myself so much I don't want to see her again. But a few days later, I did go back, and luckily the director wasn't there. And I took the class, and I think that I speak for probably every single woman who's ever been exposed to fertility awareness when I say that that class just changed my life. Mm-hmm. And that basically is how I myself learned about fertility awareness. And after that, I went back, decided this was going to be my life's work, and I went back and got my master's degree in public health at UCLA. And I guess the rest is history.
Wow, what an amazing story. I bet that executive, only if the executive director had known what...
Not only that, you know what's funny? What's so funny is not only do I have no idea what her name was, what I was just thinking about really recently, I don't even know the name of the instructor that I had. I mean, it's astounding to me because, I feel like I owe her such a debt of gratitude, and frankly, she probably has no idea who I doubt that she remembers my name. I was just, nobody. I was nobody. I just took the class, and I was trying to be really inconspicuous, and I didn't say a word because I was so embarrassed about that whole experience. So to this day, there's probably this woman out there that has no idea that she was responsible for teaching me, and I would love to be able to include her in my acknowledgments, but it was, almost 35 years ago, and I don't remember her name.
Wow. Well...
Yeah. I feel terrible about that.
Well, maybe, you never know, because maybe she remembered that moment because... I'm guessing it was
maybe, but I was
memorable.
Really trying to be discreet. Yeah.
Well, when you did write the book, so somewhere between you taking this course and learning the method and falling in love with all of this, like exactly what you said, what happens to most women when we learn about this method.
Yes.
When you wrote the book, did you have any idea the impact that it would have on the world?
Well, it's interesting because that's another interesting thing how I decided to write the book, because I never intended to write a book, ever. And there's two things that happened that made me decide to write it. The first is that whenever I taught a seminar, inevitably what would happen is that I would have women that would pull me aside during the break, and they would have tears in their eyes, and they would confess something to the effect of, I can't believe I'm, 33, and I never knew any of this, and I just can't believe it. How is it that I've gone my whole life? And at a certain point, I started hearing the same reactions over and over and over. And one of the most common reactions that I got was really after people came back for their follow-up. So in other words, they would take my seminars, and then they would complete a full cycle and call me back for their 2-hour follow-up. And what I started noticing was the catalyst for my decision to write the book, because what I heard, I can't even tell you how often it became cliche, how often I heard it. The typical response would be, they would say something along the lines of, Toni, this is going to sound really strange. And as soon as a woman said, this is going to sound really strange, I already knew what she was going to say, because she had the exact same reaction that I did, and I came to realize she had the exact reaction that all women seem to have. What she said was, I know this is going to sound really strange, but when I first took your class, I can't even tell you how exciting it was. But, and this is what every woman would say, but I have to tell you, now I'm really angry. And that's the part that really struck me. It's not, I can't get over how exciting this is, because I get that. I get that. I understand how exciting it was, because believe me, when I took that class that, 35 years ago, I had the exact same reaction. It was just like I couldn't believe this whole new world of knowledge opened up to me, this whole new world that was so practical. It wasn't just information in textbook. It was my body. So I got that. But the part that was the most surprising to me was how many women commented on the fact that their excitement turned to anger when they realized all the time that they went to the doctor and asked, isn't there some other method of birth control that doesn't wreak havoc on my body, or that doesn't cause me to have a zillion different side effects? Isn't there something natural? And inevitably they would be told that there's obviously the rhythm method, but we all know that the rhythm method doesn't work. Or women would come to me and, again, talk about their anger when they realized that when they were trying to get pregnant and they couldn't get pregnant, not once did a health practitioner talk to them about what the signs are to look for to identify not only when you're fertile, but if you have a fertility problem, which are all things that women themselves have at their fingertips, literally, if they were just taught this. And so when you ask what was the motivation to write the book, there were two things. One was this reaction that I heard over and over and over again about women's paradoxical feelings of both excitement and anger. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing was all the women that took my classes would say something to me about, I don't get it. I mean, I happen to live here in Seattle, so I took your classes. But what about all these other women all over the country who have no idea about this information? How are they getting this? And you have to remember, this was before the Internet. This was before. So it's not like women could just go on the Internet and find out any of this stuff. So those were the two catalysts that ultimately propelled me to write the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that resonates with me. I'm sure it resonates with the listeners as well. I've said on the podcast many times, it's exactly what you said, of course, because I'm a woman and I'm responding like any other woman. I was excited and really angry, and I've said that on the podcast many times. And I think part of the anger is that it's not there's something to it. It's not, you have to learn it, and it takes a bit of time to learn.
Yeah.
But it's simple. Right? Like
exactly.
It's complicated, but it's simple.
Exactly. It's the kind of thing when you first learn it, it can seem daunting because, you're learning a whole new world of information. But once you get it, it's like I describe in the book, it's like tying shoes. I mean, do you remember in the book I talk about if you were really to sit down and write how to tie your shoes, it would sound crazy. You put the left one over the right, but then once you turn it, then you have to turn it back, and you do this and that. And by the end, I'm sure women want to shoot themselves when they read how to tie their shoes. So it's a similar phenomenon. When you first learn it, it's a learning curve. It isn't just taking a pill, and that's right. It is not taking a pill. It is not sticking something in your arm. It is not sticking something in your uterus. It's not taking a pill every day. But the benefits of taking the time to really learn this information are just, it extends so far beyond just issues of fertility. It's so much more than that. It's basically a lifestyle.
Absolutely.
It's a life skill that you will have throughout your entire reproductive life.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'm interested in your perspective because you've been actively working at raising awareness and educating women for over 20 years. Obviously, the book came out 20 years ago, but you were working in this field a long time ago.
Right.
And to this day...
32 years, actually.
32 years.
Yeah.
I'm 32 years old, so that's my entire life.
Wow. That's really interesting.
Yeah. But with that in mind, I mean, many medical professionals still regard this just as you did when you went into your interview as the rhythm method and ineffective.
Right.
And so have you saw a change in that perspective, or what has your experience been like?
Yeah, when I first started, before my book came out, when I first started going to like women's clinics and doctor's offices and places like that, and I wanted to do in-services, for the medical staff, or in other words, this was for the medical practitioners. This wasn't even for the public, but I would go there and ask if I can do some kind of presentation for the medical staff. I would be treated as if I was selling snake oil. It was really embarrassing. I mean, it was, they looked at me like, you've got to be kidding. If this isn't taught in medical school, then clearly it's not scientifically validated. And so no, in the early days, it was really, really hard. And it got really old fast, trying to explain, no, this is not the rhythm method. No, it has a lot of science behind it. It's based on estrogen and progesterone and luteinizing hormone and all, follicle-stimulating hormone and all the things that they learn in medical school, but they've just never heard the practical benefits of women learning what it means and how it can be applied to them. So, it was really tough. Things now are a little bit different, and actually I should say a lot different, and this is, awkward to say, but I like to think that it's because my book has finally changed the kind of the women's health, our women's the knowledge of women's health that now the medical practitioners have that is much more practical. So I think things have changed, but it's still hard. I mean, you still get doctors and women's health clinics in general that still think that this is the rhythm method, and I have to say it gets very, very old having to explain it over and over again why it's not. Yeah.
To kind of get into the fertility awareness method a little bit, I listened to an interview that you did with Dr. Oz. I thought it was a really interesting interview. So when you encounter So if there's someone listening who maybe hasn't listened to the podcast before, doesn't really know much about fertility awareness, or does think it's the rhythm method, or is kind of skeptical, like, how could this work? And an interesting perspective from your interview with Dr. Oz and his wife was the whole, like, well, it could never work for me because my husband just has to look at me and I get pregnant.
Oh, my goodness.
So I guess maybe talk a little bit about the fertility awareness method and how you kind of address that idea.
So the thing about the fertility awareness method, the first overall thing to understand is that whether you are trying to get pregnant or trying to avoid pregnancy, or you just want to understand how your body works, it's more or less the same mechanisms. In other words, it's basically a means of being able to tell on a day-to-day basis whether or not you're fertile. Now, if you still ascribe to the myth that a normal cycle is 28 days and women ovulate on day 14, if you still believe that, if that's your paradigm, then of course you're going to say, well, why would I need to even learn this? Because I just know, women ovulate on day 14, and so why do I need to read a book? Why do I need to take a class? Wouldn't I just assume that if you want to avoid pregnancy, you don't have sex on day 14? If you want to get pregnant, you have sex on day 14 and end the discussion? Well, obviously, it doesn't work that way. As I talk about in the book, women are not Barbie dolls, and we all have unique cycles, not only amongst each other, but within our own cycles, they can vary. So what your cycle might be like may be completely different than your neighbor's, and you may have different cycles depending on where you are in your reproductive life. So the whole concept of fertility awareness method is to teach women how to tell on a day-to-day basis whether or not they're fertile that particular day. And so it involves the charting of what are referred to as the 3 primary fertility signs, which are cervical fluid, waking temperature, and cervical position. And the last one, cervical position, is an optional sign. Some women love it because they feel that it really helps them to be sure that they're doing it correctly, so it helps them corroborate the other 2 signs. And other women just find they'd rather not do their cervix, and that's fine. But the general principle is that by charting your cycles or observing those 2 particular signs, a woman can tell every day whether or not she's fertile. And then what she does with that information is what determines whether she uses it for birth control or to get pregnant. And so if she's using it for birth control, there's 4 very specific rules and guidelines that tell her when she's fertile, when she's not. And if she's using it for pregnancy achievement, it's completely different. It's not exactly the opposite of the rules for birth control, because the way to think of it is a woman in a vacuum, a woman would be fertile only for about up to 24 hours. So, for example, if we were only concerned with her egg, an egg only lives 12 to 24 hours. However, there's a reason why every woman is considered fertile for longer than just 24 hours. And that has to do with how long man's sperm can survive. So it's a very interesting little detail in terms of the politics of birth control and reproductive health in general, because the truth is that since a woman's egg can only live for 12 to 24 hours, whenever a woman uses birth control, especially the kind that cause a lot of side effects and wreak havoc or are really impractical or unpleasant or whatever, the interesting thing is she is dealing with all the side effects for protecting herself against the man's sperm, which can live up to 5 days. It's not her egg, because her own egg can only live up to 12 to 24 hours. So it's a very interesting little subtle fact that is nice for women to understand. So when they're kind of negotiating with their partners about what method would be best to use, it's helpful for men to understand that a woman by herself only has an egg that lives 12 to 24 hours. So everything else has to do with the man's sperm. So when we talk about using fertility awareness, let's say for birth control, the way to think of it is a woman is fertile for, let's say, about a week, because the 5 days that the sperm can live, up to 5 days that sperm can live, and then the day of ovulation, and then occasionally there's a second egg that's released, so we add on another day. So we say a woman is fertile for about a week. However, and this is the big point that women need to understand when they're using this for birth control, it's never enough to just say, well, okay, why don't we say that a woman is fertile for that week around ovulation? In order for the method to be absolutely effective, we need to add a buffer zone on each side and of her fertile phase, and that's where the rules or the guidelines come in. So when a woman says, well, I don't understand, how can this method be effective for birth control? The rules are designed to be very, very conservative. And so that's why you can rely on them, because the rules have already taken into account the idea that you want to put a buffer on either side to be sure that there's no potential for an unplanned pregnancy. Mm-hmm. So that, and then, by the way, for pregnancy achievement, then it's completely different. So instead of a woman being fertile for, let's say, a week to 9 days or 10 days in her cycle, for a couple trying to get pregnant, it's only the days that she actually has fertile quality cervical fluid. So for some women it may be 1 day, for some women it may be 3 or maybe 4, but hopefully people understand that concept, that when we talk about the fertile phase, it's different depending on what the woman ultimately is using the method for.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense, because when you're actively using the method to avoid pregnancy, that's what you're doing. So you have to, it just makes logical sense to have the buffer.
Yeah.
And like you said, the buffer is within the rules. So just because some women would ovulate, say, on their peak day, whereas so 75% of the time ovulation happens either right on peak day, or the day before peak day, or the day after. And 90% of the time, a woman will ovulate either on peak day, the day before, the day after, or within 2 days. So either 2 days after her peak day or 2 days before. And a very small percentage of women, so less than 10% of women, will actually ovulate 3 days after peak day. So you have to have the buffer to account for all of that.
Exactly.
But when you're trying to get pregnant, and that's a different ball game. Actually, this leads me to one of the questions that we could talk about, which is, why are some women more fertile than others?
Actually, that's a really good question. Why are some more fertile? So there's a number. Do you guys say fertile in Canada?
I think we do. Yeah, I'm noticing that every guest I've had from the States says fertile, and I say fertile.
I think it must be along the lines of a boat and oat, and those are things that we don't say. So we always know when a Canadian is in our midst by whether they say a boat, oat, and now apparently fertile. So anyway, So now I forgot the question.
Oh, why are some women more fertile than others?
Oh yeah, right. So there's a number of things. So for one thing, one of the most obvious reasons why some women are more fertile than others has to do with how much cervical fluid they produce. And one of the things is that as women get older, the amount of cervical fluid they produce tends to diminish. So just to exaggerate the point, if a woman is, let's say, in her 20s or early 30s, she may have 4 or 5 days of very fertile quality cervical fluid. So let's call it the egg white quality that's really, slippery and clear and stretchy. So a woman in her 20s or 30s might have 4 or 5 days of that. A woman who's maybe in her late 30s or even early 40s might only have 1 day or maybe just half a day. So one obvious thing is just how much cervical fluid does a woman produce. Another issue might be how often does she ovulate. If a woman ovulates, let's say she ovulates instead of every 31 or 32 days, if a woman ovulates every 24, 25 days, then she actually statistically has more opportunities to get pregnant in a year than a woman who ovulates less often. So that's another issue. Or another way of putting that is women that tend to have shorter cycles, while it may be kind of frustrating when you're trying to avoid pregnancy, when you're actually trying to get pregnant, it works to your advantage because that means you have that many more opportunities to get pregnant. So that's another issue. Another one might be, are you somebody that has a normal length luteal phase? So a luteal phase is the part after ovulation, and we typically want to see a luteal phase of at least about 10 days, and that's enough time for a fertilized egg to implant and burrow in. So, for example, if a woman tends to have short luteal phases, she would not be considered as fertile as a woman with longer luteal phases, because a woman with longer luteal phases will naturally, or one of the reasons for her to be more fertile is that she has a fertile phase that will allow for an egg to implant and be sustained. A woman that has a short luteal phase, on the other hand, she may tend to be prone to miscarriages. So that's another issue that can affect a woman's fertility. Then there's things like whether the woman has any number of conditions. The most important one, the one that I always stress the most, is whether a woman has something called PCOS or polycystic ovarian syndrome. And that is a condition that is pretty easy to identify just looking at a chart, but it's also fairly easy, in terms of just the woman's normal physical characteristics. So on a chart, the way a woman might notice if she has PCOS is that she may go for months and months without ovulating, and so her chart, the way they'll see that on the chart is that there'll be just months and months of no thermal shift. In other words, the temperatures just range low all the time. Or she may go for months and months and then finally ovulate and see a thermal shift. But even then, the thermal shift may end up being just a very short luteal phase. And so those are examples of things that women can see on their charts that might alert them to the fact they might have PCOS. Another example is maybe these women, not only do they have really long cycles, but they may have days upon days of what appears to be very fertile quality cervical fluid because it's really wet. But in a normal menstrual cycle, what will happen is that the cervical fluid will develop, the woman will ovulate, and then it will dry up. The problem with women with PCOS is they may go for months and months with attempting to ovulate. So in other words, they may go for months and months with attempting and the way they'll know that they're attempting is they'll have days of cervical fluid, and then they won't ovulate, and then it'll kind of wane, and then it'll come back again. It'll look like they're about to ovulate, and then it goes away. So these are the kinds of things that women learn about when they're charting their cycles, which are just, I can't begin to say how invaluable it is to help women to really identify what their issues might be that are preventing them from being able to get pregnant.
Today's episode is sponsored by Tempdrop. I've had so many conversations with women over the years who've had a hard time staying consistent with their temperatures. So whether you're trying to conceive, avoiding pregnancy, or charting for health reasons, Tempdrop makes fertility awareness accessible to all women, especially if you've recently had a baby and your sleep patterns are all over the place, if you work shift work and it's hard to stay consistent with temping, or if you're otherwise struggling to take your temperatures each day. Identify your fertile window in real time with Tempdrop. Know your cycle, understand your body. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/tempdrop and use coupon code FertilityFriday at checkout for 10% off your order. That's fertilityfriday.com/tempdrop. Now let's go ahead and jump back into today's episode. Coming from this perspective, I can't imagine personally not having this information. It's really hard for me to imagine, because at least if anything was happening personally, I would be able to see it. And so I really am at the point where I couldn't even imagine.
It's hard for me too. I mean, I charted for so many years that I forget that not all women have this privilege, and it really is a privilege. It's this window into their own bodies. And you forget, people like us that have charted forever, we forget that that's not the normal experience for most women.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I would we've talked a lot about ovulation, and I think it's really interesting that for myself, for example, coming from the perspective of fertility awareness, I would, in my mind, I've said this before on the podcast, have no use for an ovulation predictor kit. Maybe it'd be cool to see what it does, just for the curiosity factor. But being that I chart my cycles, I can pinpoint exactly when I'm ovulating, so I don't.
And it seems more like a waste of money, right?
Totally. That's how, from my perspective, from percentage charting. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how a woman can tell when she's ovulating, and also your thoughts on predictor kits, saliva testing strips, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Okay. So the general principle is the best way to think of it is the cervical fluid is really everything. I mean, the temperature's great because the temperature will help to corroborate that, yes, indeed, you did ovulate, but the cervical fluid is really everything. Whether you're trying to avoid pregnancy or get pregnant, the cervical fluid is everything. And the reason I say that is the bottom line is if sperm cannot get through to the fallopian tubes where the egg would meet them, then a pregnancy can't happen. So let me give an example. So if a woman is using fertility awareness to try to get pregnant, let's say she's somebody that she sees cervical fluid and she sees that she has a patch of maybe 3 or 4 days. And during that time, it gets wetter and wetter, and by the last day or the last 2 days, she notices a very clear, slippery, stretchy quality cervical fluid that's very similar to egg white. Well, for a woman like that, why does she need an ovulation predictor kit? Because her own body is showing her that she is about to release the egg. And how is it doing that? Because the cervical fluid is a direct reflection. What you see and what you feel with your fingers is a direct reflection of what is going on inside hormonally. So as a woman approaches ovulation, her cervical fluid after her period usually goes from dry to getting maybe sticky or clumpy or wetter and wetter, and eventually if a woman is really fertile, it'll develop this this wonderful, clear, stretchy quality. And it doesn't have to in order to get pregnant, by the way, but that's a really obvious sign that a woman is right around ovulation. So a woman trying to get pregnant will want to take advantage of those days. Now, once the temperature rises, that tells her that the egg has been released, and now she just wants to continue taking her temperature to see how long her luteal phase is. So the benefit of the temperature is more after the fact. The temperature tells a woman after she's ovulated. But when you're trying to get pregnant, you need your cervical fluid. And for the ovulation predictor kits, yes, they're kind of interesting because they might help corroborate. But if you have fertile quality cervical fluid, they're really a waste of money. You don't need them. If you're charting your signs, you do not need ovulation predictor kits. So that's what I would say about getting pregnant. Now, as far as using fertility awareness for birth control, I would tell women absolutely do not use the kits for birth control. Do not use the ovulation predictor kits for birth control, or you'll end up with an unplanned pregnancy. Because the problem is the kits are designed to tell you when you're about to ovulate. The problem is remember I said earlier that sperm can live up to 5 days. So let's say, just to give an example, let's say that you're taking you're checking the ovulation predictor kit starting Monday through Friday, and let's say you ovulate on Saturday. So the kit might change color or show a positive sign on, let's say, Thursday or Friday, indicating that you're about to ovulate on Saturday. The problem is, for those trying to avoid pregnancy, that's disastrous. If you're only going to count the kit to tell you when you're about to ovulate, because meanwhile you could have had sex on Wednesday and had very fertile quality cervical fluid that the kit would not have detected yet, because the kit only detects a day or two before you ovulate. So for people trying to avoid pregnancy, the kits are absolutely not. Ovulation predictor kits are not reliable for avoiding pregnancy.
Mm-hmm. I think sometimes it can get confusing, especially when women are first learning the method, because we've talked a little bit about the different perspective from whether you're trying to get pregnant or whether you're trying to avoid pregnancy. So when you're trying to get pregnant, you're looking for this fabulous, wet, clear, stretchy cervical mucus quality, because obviously that's optimal for when you're trying to get pregnant.
Right.
When you're trying to avoid pregnancy, that whole concept can lead to this less fertile, it's my personal pet peeve, less fertile, more fertile mucus conversation.
Wait, I'm sorry, I didn't understand. What was that last sentence?
when a woman's trying to avoid pregnancy, knowing that peak mucus is optimal for pregnancy achievement, then they'll start classifying mucus as some being more fertile and some being less fertile, leading to the idea that if I have unprotected sex on my sticky day or my creamy day, that I won't get pregnant.
Oh, good point. Right. Which is why the rules are as conservative as they are, because the rules say, from the perspective of trying to avoid pregnancy, as soon as you start seeing any quality cervical fluid, you need to consider yourself fertile until you can establish that the egg is dead and gone. So again, that's why there's such a difference in what you call fertile, depending on whether you're trying to avoid pregnancy or get pregnant. When you're trying to avoid pregnancy, any cervical fluid you need to consider potentially fertile. Whereas when you're trying to get pregnant, really honestly, sticky is very unlikely to lead to pregnancy. So it's not that I'm contradicting myself by saying, wait, you just said that sticky is considered fertile, and now you're saying it's not fertile. What I'm saying is that the rules are so conservative that the way you can have peace of mind of knowing that you won't have an unplanned pregnancy is by following the rules exactly. And the rules say that when you're trying to avoid pregnancy before ovulation, you wait until, as soon as you see fertile quality or any kind of cervical fluid, you consider yourself fertile, and through to when you know that the egg is dead and gone. Whereas when you're trying to get pregnant, really honestly, you want to have wet quality cervical fluid for the sperm to be able to reach the egg. So it all comes down to what are your intentions when you're trying to, when you're using fertility awareness as a method, whether you're trying to use it to avoid or get pregnant.
Well, and because not every woman observes mucus that falls into the category of sticky, because every woman's different. Some women go straight into creamy or whatever, however they're looking at it. But I would say for the woman who's thinking like, well, it's not really a fertile day if it's just sticky, what that indicates is that you're in the beginning of your fertile window. So you might not have that like abundant cervical mucus right now, but in 2 hours, you might.
Well, and another way that I tell women, I personally, I just feel better using the method knowing that during the fertile phase you abstain, but there are a lot of women who say, well, I don't want to abstain. That's too many days of abstinence. I want to be able to, have sex throughout the cycle. So what I would say is this. Look at the fertile phase on a continuum. So on the continuum of how many days you're fertile, you can look at it this way. You may only have 2 days of egg white. And then the days before, you might have, let's say, 3 days of creamy or something that's kind of wet. Maybe it's sort of cloudy. And by the way, when I use these terms like sticky, creamy, and those are just they're sort of umbrella terms, but each woman decides for herself what her cervical fluid looks like. But it's basically some variation, and I especially talk about that in the new book. It's some variation of sticky, it's some variation of creamy, and it's some variation of egg white. Maybe for you it's not creamy in the sense that it looks like hand lotion or something. Maybe for you it looks more like a kind of wet clumpy. Maybe for some women sticky isn't really like library paste. Maybe it's something else that feels sticky. The important point is each woman identifies what is normal for her, but on the continuum of her fertile phase, every woman will usually start out at one level of fertility and then increase until she's about ready to ovulate. So for most women, it means they'll start out with, let's say, some variation of sticky and some variation, like a transition from sticky to egg white that I call creamy. You could use any term you want. The important point is if you're using this for birth control and you want to be able to avoid pregnancy and still be able to have more days, you might decide that you're not willing to have any form of intercourse on the days where you have egg white, because you know for a fact, you can't claim ignorance, you know for a fact that you're about to ovulate. So you may decide, okay, I draw the line at egg white. I will not have intercourse on any days of egg white, even using 10 methods of birth control during that time. It's not worth it for my peace of mind. It's not worth it because I don't want to take a chance. But you might decide, on the other hand, on those first few days when it's kind of sticky, and realistically I know that I tend to go through a pattern of a few days of sticky and then it evolves into wetter and wetter before it gets to egg white, you might say, I'm willing to use a method of birth control like a condom, or as I talk about in the book, I think it's a good idea to use two methods like a condom and spermicide or condom and diaphragm or something during those days leading up to your most fertile time. And then that way you can shorten the days that you abstain but still have complete peace of mind. So does that make sense in terms of of extending your fertile phase so you can at least still have more days?
Absolutely, and it clarifies, because I know that's one of those things where you want women to learn the method accurately so that to avoid unplanned pregnancy, because in situations where a person is taking a chance, where they have observed cervical mucus, but they don't believe that particular type of cervical mucus is fertile. And as I always say, all mucus is fertile. And then they have an unplanned pregnancy, then they blame the method, not realizing that it's actually not the method, it's the user.
Yeah, and another, that's a really good point. Another thing is that, another way to look at it is if you're somebody, let's say that you're postponing pregnancy, maybe you have a child already and you want to wait it, however many months before you get pregnant again, you might be more willing to consider the days of sticky as infertile than a woman for whom it would be disastrous to get pregnant. The point is, it's in your control. And so, I would tell women, if they say, well, God, this ends up being like 10 days of abstaining, then I say, well, then don't abstain, as long as you understand that on those days, it may be 3 days of sticky. On those days, either use something, or if you're just postponing and you're going to be planning on getting pregnant anyway, you may know your body so well that you know darn well that the sticky really isn't going to lead to a pregnancy, and you may decide, okay, we're willing to take that small chance. But so it all comes down to, what is your particular situation at the time? What are your particular needs? And so you have total control of how you want to use the method.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. And one more question kind of along the same lines of using the method to get pregnant and identifying ovulation and cervical fluid and everything. One of the things when a woman is trying to get pregnant, I think the hardest thing is that period of time between ovulation and either a positive pregnancy test or your menstruation. Yeah. So often I'll see women starting to kind of take those pregnancy tests 6 days after ovulation, 7 days after ovulation, 8 days after ovulation. So what are your thoughts on that? It's, understandably, especially for women who've been trying for a while, every period is this huge letdown. So it's understandable wanting to know as soon as possible. But what are your thoughts on that whole
That's a really good question. So for the average woman who's not charting, I can see why she might think, well, if she starts taking her pregnancy tests earlier, then maybe she'll find out sooner. But the benefit of charting for women who are trying to get pregnant, one thing that's really great is that if a woman's normal luteal phase, for example, is, let's say her normal luteal phase is 12 days. So every cycle, she ends up with a 12-day luteal phase. So she has, let's say, 12 days of high temperatures, and then she gets her period. So for a woman like that, if she's got 12 days normally, and then one day it's 13 days, that would be a great time to take her temperature. It's before she gets her period, but she already knows that she's clearly very likely to be pregnant for that reason, that her luteal phase is longer. Another thing is that there's other things to look for. So a woman who is trying to get pregnant, and again, let's say she normally has 12 days of high temperatures before she gets her period, that woman may notice that on day 8, for example, she goes into a third level, what I call it triphasic level. So a woman, in her case, what might happen is that when the egg burrows, and usually after fertilization it takes about a week for it to burrow. So let's say a woman times intercourse, she thinks it's perfect, she's timed it perfectly, and then about a week after, she starts noticing that the temperatures now it's very subtle, but she might start noticing that the temperatures start to rise above the normal level for her. That's another time where she might want to take her a pregnancy test, and that could be as soon as a week after. And the reason she's more likely to get a positive result at that point is because the very fact that the egg is burrowed in is giving her the HCG that the test needs to tell if the woman is pregnant. There's no point in testing until the egg is burrowed in. But for some women, once it burrows in and she has HCG released in her body, it starts to increase her temperatures, and that's another way to do it. Another thing is that a woman may notice that she has what's called implantation spotting. So for her, again, in a normal situation with her normal cycle, she may have, let's say, 12 days of a luteal phase, and then she gets her period. But a woman who has implantation spotting may notice that after about 8 or 9 days, she has that kind of spotting. So that's a time where she could take her where she could do a pregnancy test, because her body is showing her. So her body gives her clues about when it's best to do a pregnancy test. So instead of wasting money on just kind of taking it whenever, if they just tune in to those subtle changes, they'll be able to maybe take their test and get a positive result sooner than the average woman.
Mm-hmm. And when a woman becomes pregnant, her temperature stays up for the majority of her cycle, or not, that doesn't even make sense, but her temperature stays up for the remainder of her pregnancy, because of course this is in response to progesterone. One of the interesting things in your book, you talked about how, in the unfortunate situation where a woman has a miscarriage, there might be early signs of that on her chart, because instead of the temperature, continuing to rise, either a triphasic shift or a gradual shift, it kind of starts to sneak down.
Right, exactly. I mean, it's a two-edged sword. I mean, it's wonderful when it stays high, but one of the ways that women can identify if they're potentially about to have a miscarriage is that exact thing. If the temperatures start to drop, then it's usually an indication, it's very often an indication that they're about to miscarry, and the progesterone levels start plummeting, and that's usually an indication. So, but one thing, by the way, that is unfortunate about temperatures in pregnancy is it would be wonderful if the temp stayed high all the way to the day of childbirth. It would be great if there was a way to just wake up that morning, see a plunge in temperature, today's it. Today's the day I'm going to go into labor. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. The temperatures do start kind of dropping off. It can be even up to a few months before a woman actually goes through childbirth. So that's one of the disappointing things, is that you can't use your temps to indicate when you're about to ovulate. About to go into labor.
Well, that would be really cool. But
yeah, it would be great if you could. Yeah.
Just popping into today's episode to invite you to join my Fertility Awareness Mastery online self-study program. If you're looking for an informative and comprehensive DIY option for learning fertility awareness, I've got you covered. This program is the most comprehensive fertility awareness self-study program available. And the best part is you can learn at your own pace in your living room for a fraction of the cost of one of my live coaching programs. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/mastery for details. That's fertilityfriday.com/mastery. Now let's go ahead and jump back into today's episode. Well, let's switch gears a little bit before we get towards the end of our interview today and talk about the 20th anniversary edition of your book. I think a lot of the listeners want to know what's different, what's new, what's updated. I have one of the older versions. Should I go out and buy the newer version? So let's talk about what you've updated. The book is huge. I'm holding it right now.
It is amazing. The new book is packed with so much more really cool content. So, by the way, if you see it there, then there is an expanded, instead of it being an 8-page color insert now, it's a 16-page color insert, and it has a lot of really interesting color graphics of things that every woman should know about. There's also the charts themselves are improved, and there now are 6 new chapters. So there's a new chapter on 3 prevalent conditions that all women should be aware of, and those are the ones that I mentioned, PCOS and endometriosis, and also just follicular cysts. And there's a new chapter on balancing your hormones, natural ways to balance your hormones. There's a new chapter on preserving your future fertility, which is really important, and a new one on causes of unusual bleeding, and one that is really important. It's called Idiopathic Infertility, Some Possible Causes When They're Not Sure Why. And that one is really helpful for women that they've done all the tests, they think that they've timed everything perfectly, and they're still not getting pregnant. So that one is a very important new chapter. And the sexuality chapter alone is packed with new stuff. So it is, in a lot of ways, it's just a whole new book. It has so much new content, and it's really exciting. I mean, I personally had, I don't know how many breakdowns writing it, but as long as you guys get this wonderful book at my expense for the last 3 years, don't you worry about me.
Well, I can see that you put your all into it. I was reading the book to prepare for our interview, and as we were talking before the interview, and I had the version that was available around 2001. So that's when I first...
Yep. So this is the 4th edition of the book. It's the 20th anniversary, but it's the 4th edition.
Mm-hmm.
So you must have had the 2nd edition, yeah.
Yeah.
It came out in 95, and now it's 2015.
Yeah, and so when I was going through this book, it's definitely more... I don't know if complete is the word, because, I mean, when I read the book in 2001, it was complete at that time.
It's just there's so much new stuff. It's so comprehensive now. It is packed, absolutely packed with, I think it has answers to any question you could possibly have about your bodies and your fertility. I'm pretty sure there's nothing I've missed, but oh my God, 3 years of hell to write it.
Well, it was well worth it. And for anyone who is considering the fertility awareness method, who's been intrigued by the conversation we had today, really, Toni and I scratched the surface of the fertility awareness method in our discussions, because to really get a good understanding of it, you do need an excellent resource, or if you're able to take a class, or what have you. But I always say it takes more than a podcast to really understand the fertility awareness method. But I recommend your book as a resource to any woman who is considering the fertility awareness method. And most women, this is their first resource. It's like the gateway drug into the fertility awareness method, if you will. So I have a few questions just to close out the show today. One of the questions I wanted to ask you is, if you ever hear someone saying either, this is too complicated, I don't think I could learn it, or if even for teens, for young women, to say this couldn't possibly be an effective method for younger women because it's too complicated and there's too many variables, how would you address that line of thinking?
I don't know if you're aware that I wrote a book for teenagers. Are you familiar?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, I think you said at the beginning. Yeah, right, Cycle Savvy. So the thing is, I would never, ever suggest that teenagers use it as a method of birth control for all sorts of reasons. I don't think that teenagers should use it for birth control. I think it's really outrageous, though, that teenage girls don't just learn the concepts in their regular health classes. And hopefully, if I have anything to do with that, that'll change. But so the concept, the idea of just charting the cycle in general is something that, like I said earlier, I try to explain that, when you first learn how to tie your shoes, it seems daunting. And then after that, it's just you don't think about. Same thing with riding a bicycle. I just feel like it's one of these life skills that once you learn it, it's a little bit of a learning curve, but once you learn it, you cannot imagine ever going back to being so ignorant about your body. I mean, you live in it. You might as well understand exactly how it works, and so that you have all the benefits of using it. I mean, fertility awareness is about so much more than just, when you're fertile and when you're not. I think, one of the things that women always talk about is how it really affects their self-esteem to be so knowledgeable. So they no longer feel that they're dirty. They no longer feel like they don't understand why they have certain signs at different times in their cycle. To be that knowledgeable is incredibly empowering. So, yes, there's no question it's a little more difficult than taking a pill, popping a pill, but the benefits are incredible. And I just wish that young girls starting around age 14, 15, maybe after they've had their period for a couple years or so, I wish that they were just taught this automatically in their health classes so that they wouldn't grow up not understanding what's going on and feeling like their body's such a mystery and so confusing. Because just having this kind of knowledge is incredibly gratifying and really does affect your self-esteem.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I would argue that women need this knowledge, regardless of how they choose to use it. So even if they don't want to use it as birth control, I feel like women need this knowledge more now than ever, given the rising, infertility rates and the challenges that women and men are experiencing getting pregnant. And so from your experience working in this field for 32 years, as you mentioned, have you noticed a difference, I guess, in the women's charts? So have you noticed a difference in women's overall health or their overall fertility in the work that you've done with women?
Do you mean, have I noticed that the charts look different now than they used to, or you mean they're...
Well, basically,
which part looks...
when you started, did more women have healthy cycles compared to now? Have you noticed a shift in terms of overall cycle health?
Oh, I see. You mean, that's interesting. What I will say is I haven't really noticed that per se, but it really does feel like more women are dealing with infertility than before, and I think that the most obvious answer to that is that women are waiting until later to have children, and so that's a definite issue, and that's one of the reasons why I devote a whole chapter in this new book to how to preserve your future fertility, because it's understandable why women are waiting until later, but there are things that they can do while they're still young to preserve their fertility, things that they can do in terms of health care and being aware of the fact that if they have a particular body type, that might be a problem in the future with their fertility. They may have PCOS that they need to address when they're younger. Women can have certain tests done when they're in their 20s that will help them to determine how many more years they have before they go into menopause. There's a lot that women can do when they're in their 20s. So I would say, to answer your question, I haven't noticed in particular that cycles look different as much as that I know that there are more women that are waiting until later to get pregnant, and that is one of the reasons why people are seeing this higher rate of infertility, because women obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, but as women get older, their fertility does tend to decline. It's really unfortunate, and it's incredibly unfair, but it's a biological fact that as women get older, their fertility starts to diminish. And, I wish it weren't that way, but that's a reality.
Mm-hmm.
So...
Well, I have 3 final questions. I ask these questions most of the time in my interviews to kind of bring everything to a close. What would you say is the biggest myth about fertility in general that you'd like to see corrected?
that women ovulate on day 14.
Yes.
Is that what everybody says?
You'd be surprised. I've had a lot of really interesting answers, but that's a big one.
That's one
and
of
the
the
28 date, that goes hand in hand with the every woman is supposed to be a machine and ovulate on, or 28-day cycles. Yes. And what is the biggest myth about the fertility awareness method that you'd like to see corrected?
That it's based on the moon and the stars and it's not effective.
All right. And final question of the day. For a woman who's listening and she's on some sort of hormonal contraceptive method of birth control, she doesn't want to get pregnant right away, but she is thinking about trying for a baby maybe within the next 2 to 3 years. What advice, if any, would you give to her?
What advice would I give her?
Yeah.
When you first come off of any type of hormone, your cycles are going to be a little tricky, and so you need to be extra vigilant if you are planning on avoiding pregnancy, because it's a little harder. When you first come off of any type of hormonal method, your body's going to take a while to get back into its normal hormones. And one of the things that's just so surprising to me is how many women, when they go off, let's say, the pill, I'm always amazed at how many women will say, I just don't understand. When I was on the pill, my cycles were so regular, and now it's like they're all over the map. And I feel like, wow, they really didn't get it, that they were on an artificial hormone that was making them have quote-unquote periods. Those were not periods at all. That was withdrawal bleeding, and it was the withdrawal of the pill that caused them to bleed. So women that are coming off and then want to get pregnant in a couple years, ironically, they're the ones that have to be extra careful, because it may take a few months for their cycles to return to normal. So during that time, before they can really use it as a method of birth control, they need to be extra vigilant, because otherwise they could have a surprise unplanned pregnancy if they're not prepared for the fact that their cycles may be a little wonky for a while until they settle into normal hormonal cycles.
Mm-hmm. It might take a little while before they start looking like the perfect charts.
Yeah.
In the book.
Not that it can't be used. I mean, fertility awareness can be used for anybody, because you're checking on a day-to-day basis. It's just that it might be a little bit frustrating, and they should have that expectation that when they're first coming off, they might have a few months where their cycles are not as perfect as they would be once they've gotten the hormone out of their system. So they need to be extra careful during that time, and always err on the side of either abstaining or using a barrier during that time until they're very clear that their cycles are back to normal. Absolutely.
Well, Toni, thank you so much for being here today. I had a great time chatting with you. I could have chatted with you for the next 2 hours. I'd ask you questions from every chapter.
Yeah.
But how can our listeners find out more information about you and your book? How can our listeners get in touch with you online? Or...
They can go to my website, which is either ToniWeschler.com, and it's, how to spell my name, ToniWeschler. I wish it were Smith, but it's not. Or they can go to tcoif.com, and there's all sorts of information there.
Okay, and I'll make sure to link to those, to your website, to the book, and all the information we talked about today in the show notes page. And so the book is Taking Charge of Your Fertility, the 20th anniversary edition, fully revised. So definitely go check it out, pick up a copy. You can get the Kindle version. So thanks again, Toni. Thanks for coming on the show.
You're very welcome, and happy charting to everybody.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode over at fertilityfriday.com/374. I hope that you enjoyed my interview with Toni Weschler. Of course, I find it to be very inspiring and very grounding, and I just find it to be fascinating that it is 2021 and women have had this knowledge for decades, and so many of us are still just, recently discovering it. I can't tell you how, I think it's probably daily or at least every other day where I'm getting messages from women who have just found the podcast, just found the information and diving into it and going down the rabbit hole. And I really do hope that one day it's just standard knowledge for all women to understand how their bodies work. And I truly do believe that this is the way. It's women helping women. It's women writing life-transforming books like Taking Charge of Your Fertility. And of course, I contributed my experiences and knowledge in the fifth vital sign, because ultimately, if we wait until the powers that be decide that this is important, I think we're just going to keep waiting. So I really do feel like it's up to us to just share this knowledge and information with other women. And I think that we're getting there. I feel like we're getting to a tipping point, because the number of women who are aware of this, the number of women who are speaking out about it, periods have had their greatest, 5-year stretch. They've been in the media, in the news. And so I do feel like we're making so much amazing ground. So with that said, I hope you have a wonderful weekend whenever you're tuning into this show. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.